Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 60 of my secular Bible study series, in which we look at the book of 1 Peter. And of course, Peter was one of the 12. In fact, he was on the inner circle of Jesus' closest friends. And after confessing that Jesus is Messiah, he is rewarded with a name change. So originally he goes by Simon, and then Jesus, using the Aramaic, calls him Cephas, which in Greek is translated to Petrus, both meaning rock, and then we get Peter from that. And who this letter is addressed to are the Christians, both Gentile and Jewish, but it does seem like there's a hint more towards the Gentile here, and I'll explain that as we go, that are around the Asia Minor territory. Peter, if he is the actual author of this, which we'll get to here in a minute, is writing from Rome, which this author calls Babylon. And so let's go ahead and break this down into 5 segments. Segment 1 is suffering and hope. It's important to endure these trials with faith. Right off the bat, Peter does something strange here. In 1 Peter 1 through 2, Peter addresses his audience as elect exiles, affirming their identity in the chosen God. This is kind of a callback to the book of Exodus and establishes the tone for this book, where we are tying an individual's suffering to their status as God's people. But of course, how is suffering rewarded? With a future promise. And that's what we get immediately following that. Assurance of the imperishable reward of heaven that awaits them. He goes on in this section to admit that, yes, suffering is real and is happening to you because you're Christians, but rejoice. This suffering is limited to what awaits you in eternity. And then he backs this up biblically by linking it to Old Testament prophecies, which we get quite a bit in this book. There's a lot of callbacks to the Old Testament. Segment 2 gets right down to the practical advice. It is a call to live holy. Again, drawing off Leviticus, be holy for I am holy, says God. Peter is preparing these people, if they are going to have this eternal reward in heaven, start getting holy now. He motivates them to live in this reverent fear of God, reminding them that their salvation has been bought not with perishable things, but with the precious blood of Jesus. Therefore, purify yourself by obedience to the truth, which we'll get to that in point 7. But it does come here, at least, with some nice advice to love each other earnestly and sincerely. In the last part of this section, we get some really heavy terms. They have a new identity as a chosen race or a royal priesthood, again alluding back to the Old Testament. Each believer is just a stone in the great spiritual house where Jesus is the cornerstone. Segment 3 is going to further into the Christian conduct, what is expected of them in a hostile world, and he has some advice about living honorably among non-believers, telling Christians to live as aliens or strangers, abstaining from all those sinful desires so that even those who oppose them can glorify God. And we get a call for submission to authorities, something I'd love to hear from the Christian nationalist about right now. And Peter is careful to say submit to every authority, whether it be the emperor or the governors, and give some examples there. In this segment, we get the slaves obey and submit to your masters, even the harsh ones, which will of course show up in point 7. Again, while he's telling everyone to just accept this abuse, he points back to Christ as the example. And then still following further in the footsteps of Paul, we get instructions for wives on how to submit to their husbands. And then finally, a big call for unity. Segment 3 is quite the section, but let's move on to segment 4, where we're going to talk even more about suffering for doing good. Here we hear about the importance of suffering for Christ's sake, for righteousness' sake, more about Christ's victory over death and what that means for the believers, living for the will of God, enduring the suffering for that will, and then, yes, even rejoicing in the suffering. Slave mentality to the highest. And our 5th segment here, our last segment here, is just the final chapter, chapter 5. And first it starts with some instructions to the elders to shepherd their flock accordingly, and that, again, we have to dangle that carrot, you will receive your crown in heaven for doing so. Then he preaches humility and watchfulness. This is where we get that verse about the devil roaming around like a prowling lion, looking for who he can devour, upping the sense of urgency and spiritual warfare, and then just closes out with a last little tidbit of encouragement. So that is 1 Peter. Let's move straight into point 2, authorship and date. So traditional authorship, endorsed by many of the early church fathers, goes straight to it being from Peter. First of all, Peter says so as much in 1:1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles. Also, early Christian tradition tells us that Peter spent his time, or final time, I should say, in Rome. It is thought that he is killed by the Emperor Nero somewhere around 64 CE. And so this aligns with writing from that area, again, which in chapter 5 he calls Babylon, kind of a common way of talking about their enemy. But of course, like any book in the Bible, there's scholarly debate on if Peter really wrote this. The main source of contention comes to us from the Greek that is used. It is highly sophisticated, incredible Greek rhetoric, a lot of understanding of the Hellenistic themes, and given what we know about Peter being an uneducated Galilean fisherman, it just doesn't seem to vibe. But then the answer for this from the traditional viewpoint is in 5:12, we get Peter letting us know, "By Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you." And having a scribe like this, or someone that would have known Greek better, isn't totally uncommon, but the back and forth just continues because, again, we can tell that when referencing the Old Testament, the author is actually using the Septuagint, the Greek version, which Peter would not have been familiar with or probably even able to read. And so even if he is dictating, Silvanus is taking it upon himself, if this were true that it's still traditional authorship, to go back and use a Greek form of what Peter would have been saying and then still implement all of these Greek stylings into the letter. It's a lot of additional thought and crafting that typically a scribe wouldn't be doing. But who can really know? Like I've said in many others, it doesn't really matter as much as, say, it does when we look at eyewitness testimony versus anonymous gospels. Something else to consider here is that if it were written later by someone, they're doing so under the name of Peter. Again, a very common practice to just have influence in their writing, still for the same purpose of trying to unite and encourage amongst suffering in the new Christian communities. There's a little bit further evidence that this could be later because of the somehow all of a sudden reconciliation between Peter and Paul. Paul gives examples himself, even in like Galatians 2, about the theological differences between Peter and Paul. But here, this really aligns very well with what Paul has preached for the most part. There's some contradictions we'll get to. So is this someone after the fact, decades later, trying to unify the message? Perhaps. That's all the thinking. In terms of dating, if Peter wrote it, it would have been probably between 60 and 64 CE before his death. And if it was written later, it could be anywhere between 70 and as late as 90 CE. Also, some of the persecution that is mentioned in this letter seems to make more sense with a later date as well, specifically with what Domitian or Trajan were doing for the persecution of Christian converts. But again, it's just impossible to say. For point 3, I think we can skip it. We've really beat a dead horse with what we covered in Hebrews and James as these authors are writing to new Christian communities in Asia Minor. This one might be a little bit more for the Gentile converts than the previous letters to the Jewish Christians. But other than that, everything that I've said about the Roman culture that was going on and how that played into the Judaism and the Christianity of the day still holds true. So let's just move straight to point 4, literary analysis. Genre-wise, it is an epistle, and in fact, it's very similar to kind of a Pauline outline, which again brings to question some of the authorship issues. But moving past that, some of the features are a lot of callbacks to the Old Testament, numerous references to the Torah, as well as Isaiah, Psalms, and Proverbs. As mentioned before, there's a lot of that rhetorical style and Hellenistic influence. We see that with chiasms and parallelisms, as well as pareniosis, which is a type of moral instruction, very common with like the Stoic or Cynics, aka very Greek. And there's not a whole lot else to say about this letter. It's pretty short, and those are really the main features. So moving straight on to point 5, main themes. You can probably guess them by the overview that I gave you, but of course one would be suffering and persecution, then salvation and redemption specifically, holiness or ethical living, and hope in eschatology. So let's move on to point 6, reception and influence. 1 Peter was highly regarded in the early Christian church, accepted almost immediately into the canon with references and endorsements by early church fathers, specifically Polycarp and Clement of Rome. However, there have always been questions around the authorship, even from some of these great early Christian men. Origen and Eusebius both pointed out the issue with the Galilean fishermen writing in this level of Greek, but they still affirmed its place in the canon because of its theological importance. A big theme that is passed down, especially in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, is that of martyrdom, the benefit of suffering for Christ. Again, we see it like with Ignatius of Antioch or back to Polycarp, who faced death for their faith, alluding to 1 Peter's teaching on suffering. We see Augustine really draw on 1 Peter in a lot of his preaching, with a focus on the theology of suffering. In fact, when Augustine is trying to deal with the problem of evil, essentially, he leans heavily on the limited suffering here on earth versus the eternal rewards in heaven, which he is getting straight from 1 Peter. This continues on all throughout the Middle Ages, and then as we start getting towards the Reformation, we see people like Luther really accepting 1 Peter for the emphasis on Christ's sacrificial death equaling salvation, or salvation through Christ's sacrificial death. Luther seems to really like the Christ being the cornerstone and this doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. This is something he talks about a lot, specifically being used as a big challenge to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church priesthood. Pretty much throughout history, anyone that was suffering or being persecuted because of their faith leaned on 1 Peter as not necessarily an excuse, but a cope, a justification for what they were going through. So there's a quick little history lesson. Let's move right into point 7, contradictions and problematic passages, starting with contradictions. And I've got a little bit of a list for us today. So first would be the difference between suffering and blessing. So if we read 1 Peter 3:13-14, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. This is a real win-win that Peter lays out for the believers. But in Matthew 10:22, the gospel might suggest differently. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. The tension here lies within, should suffering be something that is inevitable then, or is it then exceptional? In 1 Peter, he's saying that you can avoid suffering by living well. Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good? But then just in case, if you do suffer, that's also good. And Jesus is just straight up saying, the world's going to hate you regardless of what you do. You will suffer for me. But both still have this message of, but stand firm and be rewarded. But I do think that's a really interesting difference between Jesus himself and those that came after. And some of those separations made a little bit more sense when it was Paul. We often compared all the contradictions between the Pauline letters and what Jesus said. But Peter was right there walking around with Jesus. He would have heard these words, supposedly. So again, if we were trying to be really literal and take all of this as seriously as possible, we could tie that back to why this letter might have been written by someone well after Peter that was trying to reconcile Peter and Paul, but in doing so, kept up the same contradictions with Jesus himself. It's a bit messy. How about submission to authority? Again, going back to the verse 1 Peter 2:13-14, instructing believers to submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Yet in Acts 5:29, we get Peter himself declaring, we must obey God rather than human beings. And this is when faced with a command from authorities to stop preaching. This is a clear contradiction from supposedly the same character even between the two different books. And this is why you can have Christians that end up with both sides and you can take what you want from it. So again, going back to these Christian nationalists, this idea of standing up for yourself, using physical violence and force to further the work of God instead of this Jesus turn the other cheek, or sometimes when Peter is saying to obey authority and just sit back and do good regardless to be a good example. Like, where do they get this? Well, they get it from verses like Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than human beings. And all of a sudden you have a loophole for whatever you consider to be right or moral or best. You attach that to your God and now you're above the law. And that's why it is so dangerous. Again, like always, I'm going to be kind of covering some of the problematic passages as we go through contradictions, but let's keep going. Salvation through works or faith. This is just always an issue. 1 Peter 1:17 states, since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. That seems to me to be emphasizing judgment based off works. Now, there's some arguing with different ways to interpret that, but I just want to lay that out there and compare it with Ephesians 2:8-9. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Again, it just seems to me to be clear issues here. And then you add in what we covered with James versus Paul in the last book, and it's just very confusing, to say the least. This one's always been really interesting to me. 1 Peter 3:18-20. It refers to Christ preaching to the spirits in prison. Now, typically this is understood as fallen angels or the souls of the dead. This is a really strange verse, and it leads to a lot of very unique salvation doctrine ideas. But if you compare that with, say, Hebrews 9:27, people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. That suggests no opportunity for redemption. But moving on to the next one, election. Here we go. 1 Peter 1:17 says that God judges impartially according to each one's deeds. Problematic, as we've already talked about, but compare this with just a hair earlier, 1 Peter 1:1-2. Peter here refers to believers as chosen, implying some form of predestination or election. So again, it's already problematic that it's based on deeds compared to by grace alone, but even that is at odds with this idea of election or selection, which would have issues with free will, cascading issues everywhere. And I think those are the main contradictions that I'd like to point out. Let's go ahead and just move right into the problematic passages here. 1 Peter 2:13-17. This is submit yourself for the Lord's sake, by the way, which is an important distinction to every authority, and then it goes on to list those. So yeah, I pointed out the contradicting nature of people like Christian nationalists who are conveniently forgetting those verses and focusing on other contradictory verses. But this has also been used to keep people oppressed under very tyrannical and abusive government authorities. It justifies obedience to oppressive regimes. And we have many examples of this, one of them being Nazi Germany, where we have Christians that cited this verse as an excuse, essentially, to do nothing. So again, I recognize that it may seem unfair of me to say, well, people that are standing up against their government are doing wrong according to the Bible, and then people that are not standing up to their government and allowing an immense amount of harm are doing so because of the Bible. But guess what? Both are true because both contradicting ideas exist in the Bible. I just get to point out what's problematic. I'm not the one that has to try to be consistent here. So moving on. The good old role of women. 1 Peter 3:1-6 instructs wives to submit to their husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. This is an interesting part in what Peter, at least, is talking about for the submission of slaves and women. And even when we respect authority, that we're kind of living out the faith, and that's better than equality for women or a rebellion for slavery, because the end goal is, again, the rewards of heaven. So suffer now, stay in your place. This is often compared with the Roman patriarchal household, and whatever the head father believed is what everyone else in the household believed. So that's really hard for Christians, especially women and slaves in this Roman world. And so he's kind of giving them this excuse of, no, lie low, just do good works. Maybe you'll win them over this way, which practically isn't terrible advice. But again, for a God of perfect truth, who's had no problem uprooting society, to have to play within the context of the time is just a cop-out. But let's move on to the submission of slaves. We could have talked about that in contradicting passages, but we'll just list 1 Peter 2:18-20. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. Gross. For so many reasons. One, we have just an acceptance of slavery. Just one time, if just one person who knew Jesus and followed Jesus could have said, Jesus doesn't stand for this, but we never get that. Nowhere close. Not from anyone in the Bible ever. Every anti-slavery thing you think is in the Bible is this mixed up, completely vague or out of context verse. We have specific verses like this saying, hey, slavery exists. We know so. We know there's good masters and we know there's bad ones. And guess what? Your job as a Christian is to bear it. Even worse than that, because it's praised. It is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering. No, it's not. I said slave mentality at the beginning of the video because of this kind of a verse. This is horrendous and obviously problematic. We already covered 1 Peter 3:1-6, the submission of wives. But if we want to talk about more bad advice towards women, we can read 1 Peter 3:3-4. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. So, how does God want his women? Gentle and quiet. Once again, reinforcing those horrific horrific things that we see from Paul about women keeping their mouths shut and not being permitted to speak in church, not being able to have leadership or teaching over men. But yeah, the Bible's all for gender equality. There's no patriarchal systems going on here. Going back to Christ preaching to the spirits, I want to give you the full context of the verse. So here it is, 1 Peter 3:18-20. After being made alive, so Christ's resurrection, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. So again, with that extra context through the whole verse, we can see why people think that it is for the fallen angels. Or again, people have just said the days of Noah, the days of old. This is for any non-Israelite before Christ. They get their chance. Again, people just use this verse however they want it to make whatever theological point they need to make to counteract whatever unfair point is being brought up about how Christ only came at one time in history, God had a chosen people, and all the other things that we bring up that show the inconsistencies with this God. They try to fix with this one very vague and confusing verse. We can get to 1 Peter 4:7. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. So now we have Jesus, Paul, James, and Peter who have thought and said that the end is near. And we always get all the excuses because obviously Jesus hasn't come back. And each excuse looks a little bit different, but generally it comes down to near is a confusing word. Near doesn't have to mean what you think it means. God's time frame is totally different. Why, I wonder, would Peter be telling the individuals to be alert and sober of mind if near didn't mean their generation? It is such an obvious goalpost moving when all four of these men have indicated clearly. Jesus went as far as to actually spell out, I tell you the truth, there will be people in this generation that will not pass before the coming of man. So if you can excuse that, you can definitely excuse this. I get that. But it is so obvious that these early Christians were living in this immediate expectation, and rightly so, scripturally speaking, and it didn't happen. That makes Jesus a false prophet, and it makes the religion completely void. I just really think this is one of the biggest things in the Bible that Christians have to play such mental gymnastics with to continue their belief. It's beyond obvious when you really look at it. Again, going back to the beginning of the book, 1 Peter 1:1-2, we get that elect, that predestination, which is problematic for all the reasons I don't need to continue to spell out. The main one being, there goes free will. There goes God's perfect love and justice. And one last one, just to beat a dead horse, would be 1 Peter 4:12-13. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you. Again, now we have this persecution being shown as a test. Interesting. As though something strange were happening to you. But instead rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the suffering of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. So once again, suffer. It's your place. God's doing it to test you, but you'll be rewarded and it will be worth it. And this idea of compensation from heaven or crowns of glory, which Peter also talks about, is just a horrific excuse for the suffering of man, and teaching people to revel in their suffering, to not fight against it, to not improve their lives, to put their head down and take their lashings because God is sovereign and he'll test you if he wants. But there's good and better things on the other side. How did I ever go so long believing that this was a good God if this were true? And knowing that it's not true even helps me understand how much more problematic this advice is, and why Christian communities, however beneficial they may be, if tied to these kinds of doctrines, will always have a byproduct of harm. It's built into the foundation of the belief. So that is 1 Peter. That is a mess in 5 chapters, which we have found is very easy to do. 2 Peter's next week, it is only 3 chapters. Then we have the 3 books of John, which I might just put all in one episode. Like, I really had this idea that I liked 66 episodes for 66 books, but 2 John is like 70 words or something. So I need to figure out how I'm going to do that. And then Jude, and then Revelation. Wish me luck as I finish putting all of this together. Thank you so much for being here. Let me know your thoughts on this one. I'll see you Sunday with another video, and until then, keep thinking. I'd like to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, JimothyJones, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Shan, Sparky, Thronus, and Todd J, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.